This is Duke University.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Matt Nash. I'm the executive of CASE, the Center for the Advancement of Social Entrepreneurship, and it's really our pleasure to have you here this evening. This is really a highlight of our year, the CASE Award for Leadership in Social Entrepreneurship. For those of you who aren't familiar with CASE, we are a center for education, research, and field building on social entrepreneurship here at the Fuqua School of Business. And really, we see ourselves in the businesses of preparing leaders and organizations to change the world. Since we're at a business school, we're especially interested in promoting the entrepreneurial pursuit of social impact. This is a program that focuses in many ways for our students here who are in the MBA program. We offer courses and career support and financial aid and speakers, and collaborate very closely with our students in the Net Impact Club. We have events throughout the year. I encourage you to check out our website, CASE@Duke, CASE@ spelled out, duke.org, for events. For example, you might want to write down, if you're in the Durham area, on February 15th is our annual Net Impact Club's Duke Conference on Sustainable Business and Social Impact. It's an amazing day. Yeah. Beth is leading that with some colleagues, and it's a great day of all kinds of panels and speakers, and it's exciting. If you haven't been to that, we have hundreds of folks here focused on topics from sustainability and social impact, and it's a great day. So February 15th, Wednesday, actually about the seventh time we've done that now. We're really thrilled to welcome you tonight to our 9th annual CASE Leadership in Social Entrepreneurship Award. It's a special night, and I think you'll find out why as you hear our speaker and distinguished award recipient tonight. Each year, we seek to recognize someone who has made distinguished contributions to the field of social entrepreneurship. And we're looking for folks or organizations, could be philanthropists, could be authors, could be thought leaders, could be social entrepreneurs who's really helped to move the field forward in some significant way, so really contributing to the development of the field of social entrepreneurship. Some of our past recipients have included Vanessa Kirsch, the founder of New Profit and Public Allies, Jacqueline Novogratz, the founder of Acumen Fund, author David Bornstein, Wendy Kopp, the founder of Teach for America, Bill Drayton, the founder of Ashoka, Mohammed Yunus, microfinance pioneer, founder of Grameen Bank, Ami Dar, the founder of Idealist.org, and Bill Strickland, many of you know him from Manchester Bidwell Corporation. So it's really a distinguished honor roll of individuals who've made significant contributions. I really also need to take a moment to thank an alumnus and CASE Advisory Board member, Jimmy Childry, who is in the audience, but he's escaping my eyes at the moment. Jimmy, through his generous support, has actually helped us to make this an award that we can do each year, and has supported us in making the CASE Leadership in Social Entrepreneurship Award that we bring to you each year. So we appreciate Jimmy's generous support in that. Tonight, we're honored to present this award to Antony Bugg-Levine, who is the CEO of the Nonprofit Finance Fund, but has actually had a fascinating career in different aspects of the social sector and in consulting, and we're going to hear about that. And really, probably the best way to introduce him is to invite my colleague, Professor Kathy Clark, to introduce to you, to present the award and introduce Antony to you, and then also to moderate some of our discussion. So join me in welcoming Kathy Clark, who will introduce Antony.
Thanks, Matt, and let me welcome everyone again. This event is very special for us. Not only are we presenting Antony Bugg-Levine with the 2011 Leadership in Social Entrepreneurship Award, but I'm pleased to announce that this is our inaugural event of the CASE i3 Speaker Series. And for those of you who are wondering what that is, let me tell you about it. CASE i3 is our new initiative on impact investing. I direct the program, and so I want to tell you a little bit about what we're up to and why having Antony here to launch it is such an incredible experience. Impact investing is the idea of investing with the intent to generate financial returns while also generating tangible environmental and social impacts. We at CASE have been exploring the role of capital markets to support social ventures and social enterprises for many, many years. But this new groundswell of interest around the potential for coordinated strategic marketplaces for investing in impact is a significant trend, and one that we felt was timely for academic inquiry. We launched Case I3 in September, so 3 months ago, and it appears to have been and still be the first global comprehensive effort at a top 10 business school to explore and understand this new field. Our programs are very much still in development, as you can imagine, but we have some significant new efforts underway, and I just wanted to give you a sense of some of those. We are concentrating on 3 different audiences that we believe are important as the field emerges. Those are students, practitioners, and academics. Students need better information, training, and access to this developing field. And I'm guessing that most of the people in this room are students. So if you're a student, raise your hand. All right, so easily 90% of the room, so that you know, Antony. For practitioners, we see a need for learning from their peers, and we are actually involved in developing some new peer networks and guides and handbooks for investors at all levels, from investor angel groups to fund managers to some publications that are geared to private wealth advisors around the globe. And then for academics, we see a primary leverage point at this point being actually around data, which is that a lot of the exploration of this field so far has been anecdotal. And we are really interested in trying to understand what we can about the true performance and the mechanisms that different impact investors and companies use to achieve impact. And so we're pleased to share with you that we've been selected as the global research coordinator for the first global impact investing rating system called GEARS, which is kind of like a Morningstar rating, but for impact of investment funds. And we are working to engage researchers around the globe with the data that's being collected by that project. Much of this work, which our faculty, administration, and students are so excited about here at Fuqua, I have to admit would probably not be possible were it not for the work of Antony Bugg-Levine. I'm going to reiterate some of the critical points of his bio, but then I wanted to say a little bit more than that. Antony designed and led the Harnessing the Power of Impact Investing initiative at the Rockefeller Foundation over the past several years. While there, he helped establish the Global Impact Investing Network. He helped create GEARS, which I just talked about. He helped create IRIS, which is a set of standards for impact. He helped Rockefeller to become the only US institutional investor in the social impact bonds experiment in the US. I could go on, but I'm going to let you talk about your learnings from those things. His background is also quite varied. He has worked in Kenya and Uganda as part of TechnoServe. He has been part of McKinsey. He's a native of South Africa, and he, as I was, is an adjunct professor at Columbia Business School. He has now become the CEO of the Nonprofit Finance Fund, which is a national nonprofit and financial intermediary that helps mobilize and deploy capital and innovative capital solutions, which include things like philanthropic equity, new market tax credits, program-related investments, and social impact bonds. And if they were looking for someone to lead further capital market innovations, I think they chose the right guy. So when we were thinking about this year's award, I will admit I was one of the strongest advocates for selecting Antony because I think he's done something very unusual for people who have jobs within foundations. I can speak to this a little bit because I worked for a foundation for 7 years. And it's very common for people in that job to kind of step back and say, okay, we got some things we need to accomplish. Who's doing the best work? And how do we fund the people who are doing the best work and hope that something great happens as a result? Antony did something much more entrepreneurial. He looked at the field and he said, you know, there are all these people who are working in different aspects of this field, but they're actually trying to do the same thing, but they don't know it. And so what we need to do is bring them together. Excuse me. And over a series of individual conversations, of convenings, he allowed a very large and significant group of different actors to recognize their common power. First thing was language. People were all over the map, double bottom line, social this. He said, no, he brought together a meeting that coined the term impact investing and actually created an umbrella for people to see themselves as a larger thing. He worked very hard to think about what were some of the infrastructural pieces that these people needed to be able to work together, and created some of them. And then he created, as I mentioned, the GIN, the Global Impact Investing Network, organizations where peers could come together and build much beyond where they were at the moment. So not only did he act in all of these areas, leveraging Rockefeller dollars into a much greater whole, but he has also written, with his and my illustrious colleague Jen Emerson, the best guidebook that I've come across about how to keep the momentum going, and to build the emerging sense of the importance of impact investing into what we hope will be a stable, lasting movement into the future. So I am very honored, very humbled, and very impressed to be bringing Antony up and to be able to recognize all that he has done to excite a new generation about the potential to blend sector approaches and solve social problems. So it is my pleasure to present Antony with the 2011 Leadership in Social Entrepreneurship Award.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I think we're going to take this down so it's not blocking you.
Great.
And let you speak.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Kathy.
Sure.
And for those of you who don't know, there is definitely going to be a room reserved in the Impact Investing Museum for Kathy Clark and for the great work that's been done at CASE at Duke over the last few years. I'll talk a little bit about the kinds of systems changes we're going to need, as Kathy said, not only to sustain the momentum, but also to make this work truly relevant to creating a just and vibrant society. And in that, I think certainly you guys at Fuqua, through the leadership of Kathy and her team, and can count yourselves among the few who figured this out early enough and started really breaking down the old barriers that have kept so much of us apart. So just wanted to thank you, and I'm particularly honored to be here, not only to accept this award with, I have to say, quite a ridiculously humbling list of former recipients, including a Nobel Prize winner and an author who has sold many more copies of his book than I have of mine. But it's particularly, it's great to be here and to kick off the Impact Investing series as well. So just wanted to thank you for that. I just want to talk a little bit about social entrepreneurship and then quite a bit about impact investing. And as Kathy said, not only about the work we have done over the last few years, but also about where it's going and what it's going to take to really make this relevant. And so, before I begin, I think one point just about this award as well. So it's personal for me. When I left Rockefeller I've been in my new job about 5 weeks. And when you're in a foundation, one of the things people say to you is, you think you're funny and you think you're smart. It's just because you have money. That people, they say once you join a foundation, it's the last time you tell a joke people don't laugh at. And so as I was preparing to leave Rockefeller, people said, good for you, but you're really going to be in trouble and no one's going to want to have you anywhere and no one's going to give you speeches and you think it's because you're so smart and good looking, but it's actually because you have this name Rockefeller and people want your money. So I think Kathy contacted me about this award about the same week that I left Rockefeller. So it was particularly validating for me to know that even after I left the foundation, there was an opportunity to still be relevant. So that's a particularly great timing. So it is funny for me to receive an award around social entrepreneurship. I don't exactly have a great definition of what a social entrepreneur is. And I'd love for one of you to have a better definition than me. The definition I have going in is a social entrepreneur is someone who runs a nonprofit who's sick of striking out at bars. So you walk in, you're like, hey, what do you do? I run a nonprofit. Whatever. What do you do? I'm a social entrepreneur. Oh, I'll take that guy's number. So hopefully if you can get someone's number because you're a social entrepreneur, hopefully being a social entrepreneurship award winner will help me feel even more validated in the future. But I don't know, I think obviously I wouldn't come to a case at Duke and claim to know more about social entrepreneurship than you do. I would say that over the last few years, I've had a great privilege of being able to work with literally hundreds and even thousands of people around the world, developing a deep understanding of what impact investing is. And as Willie Foote at Root Capital, a great organization in Boston and a true social entrepreneur, who probably doesn't strike out at bars, although his wife might not be happy for me to say that. Willie has a great phrase where he says, impact investing is the other side of the Velcro to social entrepreneurship. And I think, of course, it's all part of the same spirit. And the spirit that really fuels both sensibilities around social entrepreneurship and impact investing is a basic rejection of what in the book we refer to as the bifurcated world. The idea that on one hand, the only purpose of business is to make money, and on the other hand, the only way to solve social problems is through charity and government. And I think what social entrepreneurs and impact investors both do collectively, and it really is part of the same, it's the same, different sides of the same Velcro, but it's very much part of the same story, is reject that bifurcated worldview for a much more integrated understanding of how we can organize our talents and our capabilities to create the world we want to see. So what I want to do in the next 20 minutes or so is talk to you a little bit about the good news of impact investing. And if you'd hear me give this speech or talk about the book over the last few years, the whole talk would have been about the good news, because I think we were trying to create a broader arena in which people accepted that for-profit investing is a morally legitimate and economically effective way to solve social problems. So I'll give you a little bit of the good news. But I also want to talk about two dangers and threats that I see threatening the potential of impact investing and social entrepreneurship to really be what it needs to be for the moment we live in. And those two threats are the fact that we focus too much on individuals and enterprises and deals and not enough on systems, and the fact that too many conversations about social entrepreneurship and impact investing are acontextual. I think it's always been true. It is increasingly unacceptable given the context of the world we live in. So I want to talk a little bit about the good news and a little bit more about the systems, which is really the core of the book, and then really challenge you to think about the context in which you are all living in, graduating into, or those who aren't students, working in. So let me just start with the good news. As I said, the good news is that over the last few years of impact investing, and I think over a decade or more before then, and one of the previous winners of this award, two of them, have had as much to do with this as anyone else in terms of popularizing these ideas of Bill Drayton and David Bornstein. The good news is that over the last few years, we have become increasingly effective as a movement in, again, expanding that arena where people recognize that business and investing can be part of the tools we harness when we set out to solve social problems. Now, that's either a really obvious idea. Maybe some of you think it's obvious. Maybe some of you think it's obvious now and you didn't used to. It's also an incredibly radical idea. And again, I think it's obvious because many of your life experience, an increasing number of people out in the world, have either run or worked in businesses where it was obvious to them that what motivated them wasn't just money, or they've worked in nonprofit organizations where it's been clear to them that unless they ran that organization in an effective business-like way, they couldn't have the social impact they wanted to. It's an obvious idea to people that we shouldn't separate out how we think about our lives, that if we consider ourselves to be morally principled people, that should extend to how we think about our investments. And again, there's a set of ideas that have been forming around these basic concepts for decades and even hundreds of years. So on one hand, it's a very obvious idea. On the other hand, it's also a very radical idea. And the reason why it's radical is because it is an idea that goes against a set of systems we've organized our society around that really still insist that the only way you should solve a social problem is by working in a philanthropy or working in government, and that if you work in business or you're an investor, you should be doing it just to maximize financial return. That's a world that still pervades and the systems pervade, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. But people are not waiting for the world's mindsets to change to start making a difference using these tools. I can give you lots of examples, three that I find particularly exciting, ways in which people are already putting the tools of impact investing to work to address social challenges. In a few hours in Hyderabad in India, some young boys and girls are going to wake up who live in the slum, an informal settlement. They're going to wake up, they're going to walk to school in a school uniform, and they're going to attend a school that's educating them more effectively than the government schools in the neighborhood, if the government schools even exist in their neighborhoods. And they're going to be getting that education not because the government subsidized those schools or because a charity came in and built the school, but because an impact investing fund called the Indian School Finance Company has figured out a way to underwrite loans to the thousands of private schools that exist in these slums that are affordable to most of the people who live there. So this might sound a little crazy, but it turns out around the world, most poor people actually will send their children to private schools because many of the poorest people in the world live in the communities most underserved by government services. I see some people nodding their heads. I think if you live in a emerging market, you probably know what I mean. I think it's something we haven't experienced in this country as powerfully for a long time. But in many cases, private schools and affordable private schools are actually the engines of education that can offer hope to deeply disconnected and underprivileged people. The Indian School Finance Company was built on the idea that many of these schools can actually grow through absorbing loan capital as opposed to needing charity. And by proving that point, they've enabled banks and other investors to figure out how to put their money to work, give loans to these schools, they can pay them back. They tend to charge between $5 and no more than $12 per student per month. Not enough for everyone to send their kids there, but enough for most families who live in the slum to send at least one child to that school. And so again, the point of that story is these schools are now expanding. They're hiring new teachers. In some cases, they're buying computers. They're putting another room on the schoolhouse, expanding the capacity. And those girls I described are going to wake up tomorrow morning and have a decent schoolroom to go to because a lender figured out how to lend. That's an impact investment. Halfway closer to the world is a community who live on the eastern border between the Congo and Rwanda. And when they wake up in a few more hours, they're going to be harvesting vanilla and coffee. And when they harvest that, they're going to be selling it to an importer on the other side of the border in Uganda, who has figured out through contracts with European importers how he can sell those coffee and vanilla to Europe in a much higher value chain. Because they've figured out that supply chain, those farmers and those farming families in eastern Congo are going to be able to get far more money for their crops than they would have otherwise. In order to make that happen, again, an impact investor was crucial. In this case, Root Capital, who I mentioned earlier, who have figured out a model that allows them to lend to companies like that Ugandan importer, and in most cases to the farmer cooperatives themselves. And a little bit of loan capital done in the right way at the right time allows these families to get the money when they need it, gather the crops, sell them at a scale that allows them to enter into an international supply chain, improve their incomes. In most cases, those families are then plowing that extra money back into health facilities and school facilities in their communities, and you see the long-term effect. This is not just an international story. In California, right now, we don't have to wait a few hours, families in some of the poorest neighborhoods in Los Angeles and elsewhere will, for the first time, be able to go walk into a grocery store and buy fresh food for dinner. Again, this might sound a little bit esoteric, but it's a huge problem in this country that most of you know. It's been a big topic that the First Lady's taken up around obesity, and especially childhood obesity. It's highly correlated with income. And it turns out that some of the poorest people in our society actually cannot buy healthy food even if they want to, because many of the poorest communities have been abandoned by the kinds of grocery stores that sell fresh produce. This might sound a little wonky, but solving this problem is a huge imperative for a whole set of other challenges that we face around inequality and health and where we spend money and health outcomes. That grocery store and the capacity for that poor family to buy fresh produce for dinner, again, didn't come about because of a government program, because of philanthropy, came about because of a really interesting impact investing fund organized by the California Endowment called the California Fresh Works Fund that has now raised $230 million of loan capital, $200 million from banks, $30 million from the foundation, to give to grocers and other fresh produce sellers who are willing to open up in these abandoned communities. The point of all those stories is that in every case, someone has solved or started to solve a social problem, not relying on the old tools of philanthropy and government, but using the tool of investment. So that's the good news. And again, I could go on and on about the many other things that are happening around the world that really prove anecdotally that impact investing has the ability to change how we think about solving social problems. And if that was all we were setting out to do, then I could stop there and take my nice award and go drinking early. But I'm actually deeply worried. And I'm worried about two things. One is the danger that while we focus on those kinds of deals, we don't think enough about the systems in which those deals are happening and what it's going to take to build a new set of systems that can match the aspirations of impact investors and social entrepreneurs. I'm also worried that many of the people who are thinking about these are not thinking enough about the context in which we do this work. And so let me talk about the systems first. In every case that I've talked about, whether it's the California Fresh Works Fund or the Indian School Finance Company or Root Capital, for us to get to the point where I can tell you the good news story about the lives changed, a crazy person had to set out on an unbelievably ridiculous adventure and had to do it against a whole set of systems telling them they were crazy. That's the social entrepreneur that we celebrate. And I'm sure through your work at Case, you've met many of them on this stage. They've come here, and partly why we're inspired by them is because they set out to buck the trend. Willie Foote quit Harvard Business School a few weeks after he started because he decided that actually he had something more pressing that he needed to do with his life than go to business school. The person who founded the Indian School Finance Company he's an Atlanta entrepreneur who sold the family business and is generally considered insane by most people who meet him. He's a wonderful guy named Bob Patillo. But he had to be someone who was willing to have his family and his friends tell him that he was crazy before he could set out and do something as amazing as the Indian School Finance Company. In the case of the California Freshworks Fund, that was organized through a visionary leadership from the California Endowment, who hired a woman named Tina Castro from Goldman Sachs, who had to bang her head against a very typical world in which she was told, well, if you're an investor, be an investor. If you want to be a grant maker, be a grant maker, but stop trying to tell us that we should be using investments to solve this problem. And so as long as impact investing and social entrepreneurship is about those heroic people who can bang their heads against existing systems, then that's what it's going to be limited to. And again, I think we celebrate people who overcome the systems, but the more profound question is to not say, how can we create more Bob Patillos and Willie Footes? But it's how do we change the system so that more people get to be part of this movement who don't need to be Bob Patillos and Willie Footes and Tina Castros. And the reason why this is so crucial, because as long as impact investing and social entrepreneurship are about a few individuals creating interesting companies and running interesting deals, that'll be a massive contribution to the world. But the world's problems are bigger than that. And we can't afford to simply have people banging their heads against systems and having the few people whose personal character or life circumstances allow them to do that to be the only people who can participate. What we need to do is fundamentally change the mindsets and the systems that support the idea that you have to separate out how you make money from how you solve social problems. Most of you in this room who find these ideas compelling, I hate to say it, and let's be brutally honest, are not when you graduate going to go into impact investment. And the few of you who do are going to go home, and next fall you're going to go home for Thanksgiving, and most of your family is going to think you're crazy. You're not going to be able to explain what you do. And at some point, that's going to get frustrating, and some of you are going to fall off. That's the price we pay for leaving our whole world as a focus on those charismatic individuals who overcome the systems, as opposed to thinking about the systems that need to change themselves. So what we do in the book is we take, in the second half of the book, each chapter describes one of the systems that needs to change. And I'm just going to quickly describe some of those. And these are all systems that have been built up in very smart and elaborate ways to support a bifurcated world. If you agree that the only purpose of investing in business is to make money, and the only way to solve social problems is through government and philanthropy, then our legal and regulatory systems make perfect sense. You want to solve a social problem? Go start a nonprofit. You want to go into business? Well, the government's going to make sure, to the best of its abilities, and at times better than other times, that you are a good steward of those assets and do well by your investors. So our legal and regulatory system works as long as you think that the bifurcated world makes sense. And in fact, if you start that nonprofit, you're going to get a tax break because the government realizes that private citizens need to contribute to solving social problems. And one way to encourage that is to give people tax breaks when they make donations. Well, that's all well and good. But what if you're Willie Foote and you start an organization that's going to lend as opposed to simply giving money away? You can invest, and you can invest in root capital. Should you get a tax break for that investment? Our law doesn't really know how to handle that. And what about, on the other hand, in the Nonprofit Finance Fund, we have $60 million on balance sheet. We manage about $200 million of investments. If you invest in my fund, should you receive a tax break? And if I take your money and I put it into an investment that gets you a decent return and a fantastic social outcome, should the government let me do that? Because right now, the fiduciary duty laws tell me that as an investment asset manager, I have a legal obligation simply to maximize your returns. So our legal and regulatory system is not caught up to the aspirations of an integrated world. Neither is our leadership development system. And again, I think the simple way to think about this is, many of you probably experienced this. You go to business school, most of your business school is going to tell you, we're training you how to be an ethical leader. And your life's work is to make money. And at the end of your life, we're going to tell you to give some of that money away. And the famous alumni who come and talk to you here are people who live that life's path. And if you say, I want to solve social problems, they're going to tell you, well, head over to the policy school. And at the policy school, they're going to teach you how to use government, and they're going to say, be skeptical of those business people. Let's figure out how to regulate them. But certainly harnessing them, well, anyway, I don't need to. Sounds like you guys know that part of the story. I'd say, this institution is out ahead of others. Others are starting to catch up. But generally, we have a sense in our leadership development. And it's not just about what we teach, but again, it's about how we teach. Is it about the individual as a unit of analysis or the system itself? Briefly, for those of you who do interact with the foundation world, clearly our philanthropic system has to change fundamentally. I no longer work at a foundation. I can now say more boldly than I did before, although I don't think it's ever been a secret, that the fact that the $600 billion that are held in foundation endowments in the US are almost entirely invested with no concern for the social impact they generate under a bifurcated worldview hypothesis that the moral obligation of investment assets is to make money so that we can throw over $40 billion a year as grant making is crazy. 100 years from now, it will be recognized as such, and we will be considered profligate for letting it go on as long as it did. For now, it absolutely makes sense. The people I know who run foundation endowments, who manage that $600 billion, are universally incredibly principled, morally driven people who could be making more money doing other things in most cases, and who are deeply motivated by the sense that their moral duty is to maximize the financial return of those assets in order to create more money to throw over for grant making. That completely makes sense if you believe in the bifurcated world. It makes absolutely no sense if you believe in a world that says those investment assets could be producing social good while they're being invested and not only when they're given away. And so our entire philanthropic system is going to change. And huge disruptions are occurring because of that. I'm happy to get into that more later. The last system that has to change, this is quite obvious, is one that probably more of you will be working in than any other, and that's our capital market system. The entire infrastructure and system we've set up to manage money. If you're fortunate enough to make money, you're going to get 2 phone calls right now. One is from a wealth advisor who's going to say, give me your money and I'll make sure it stays for your kids and I'll let you have a nice life. Another is going to be from a philanthropic advisor who's going to say, I'll help you give your money away to create social purpose. Well, what happens when you say to those 2 guys, okay, well, I think my investments should create social purpose? Your wealth advisor is not going to know how to handle you. And if they go back to their bosses and say, I want to create an impact investing product, they're going to say, well, we're the risk management department. We don't do that. That's for the philanthropy people. And the philanthropy people are not going to understand you because they're trained in helping you give away your money. So we have an entire capital market that exists to take money from its owners and to place it with those people who can best fulfill the aspirations of the owners by putting it to work. That occurs in a bifurcated world and needs to occur in a more integrated way. So we need new systems to develop, and I'm happy to, again, to talk in the question and answer period about very exciting initiatives occurring around the world to make that happen. But I want to add sort of one more really important threat. Even if we tell the good news and we get more inspired entrepreneurs excited, as I said, we're going to create limited difference in some important, the people in Hyderabad, the people in Congo, the people in LA, they're really grateful and incredibly empowered by the fact that impact investor and entrepreneurs have done what they've done. I think we can extend that even further if more people understand that we can build these systems and create the basis for far more people to participate. But what if that works? What if over the next 5 years we create these systems? We have a new legal system. We have a new system for organizing philanthropy. Another system that has to change is how we measure value. How do we measure social impact as effectively as we measure financial returns? I see Sarah Gelfand from IRIS is here at the forefront of making that happen. So these systems are getting built. Well, what would that world look like if that's all we do? And again, I think this is where I really worry that the conversation is not contextual enough. Because we could build those systems and we could put, of that $600 billion, we could put hundreds of billions to work and we could capitalize lots of solutions. That would still not be a world that I want to live in. And it certainly wouldn't be an America I want to live in. Because a vast majority of what we need to do as a society to deliver a just and vibrant society for ourselves and for our children is going to take more than just entrepreneurs doing entrepreneurial things. The fabric of what allows a society to be just and decent is highly tied up in locally driven, community-based, nonprofit organizations and community enterprises who are delivering the meals to hungry people. They're putting beds together for people who don't have a roof to sleep in. They're the ones running our community centers. They're the ones taking care of children in the afternoons whose parents have to work. And if we don't have something to say about that fabric, and if we don't have, as a movement, as an impact investing and social entrepreneurship movement, something to say about the context in which we work, we ultimately will have failed to take advantage of this opportunity. I see a lot of you aren't from the US. I think impact investing has had a lot of play, in terms of poor countries. It's deeply relevant in America, so if I can just be parochial for 3 minutes. What's the context in which we live? Well, in Midtown Manhattan, where Nonprofit Finance Fund's New York office is, it seems like a lot of people talk about a financial crisis that occurred in the past. Well, and certainly when you go to Midtown and all the fancy restaurants are full, it does seem like there was a financial crisis and it's over. In the Nonprofit Finance Fund, we work with thousands of organizations, many of which are large organizations, have the ability to take on loans, buy new buildings, many of which are small community-based organizations who are on the ground delivering those meals, putting those beds together. And I can tell you that for them, there is not a financial crisis that passed. There is an employment crisis that is deeply present. And it's not just an employment crisis, but it's an employment crisis that's leading to a fundamental crisis of the basic ability of our society to deliver a decent and just world. In New York City, 68%, I think, of people responding to a recent poll said they know someone in their family who's going to go hungry this winter because they don't have money. The food bank is being forced to cut its services by 20% because of budget cuts. In Boston, I was there last week with two of the most dynamic CEOs. One CEO I met, I would put her against any Fortune 500 CEO in terms of her vision, her dynamism, her capacity to execute. She happens to run one of the biggest homeless shelters in Boston. Demand is up. She's expecting 20% more people to show up this winter needing beds. Right now, a few of them are hanging out with the Occupy people, so it's a true story. Demand is down. Once that camp breaks down, more of them are going to come to her. She's doing that against budget cuts. And again, for many, many people, the organizations that deliver the basic fabric of a decent society are in a crisis. And the crisis is not this sort of cyclical crisis that's occurred in the past. It's a crisis about a fundamental nature of inequality in the society, the fact that over the last, between 1979 and 2007, the income of the richest 1% in this country almost tripled. The income of the poorest 20% stayed basically flat. So it's a crisis of inequality. Historically, at the end of recessions, inequality gets worse in America. It's only going to get worse. But more than being cyclical, it really is structural. There's a fundamental breakdown in the model that has existed for 30 years in this country of how we fund our basic social fabric. And that model was foundations did a little bit of innovation. Government fundamentally bankrolled most of what happened. Foundations on the back end picked up a little bit. That model is broken. And most of the organizations we work with, the Nonprofit Finance Fund, are touching different pieces of this beast. And the beast that exists in this country is a real worry that I and others have that it's not only a cyclical nature of there not being enough money, there's increasingly an abandonment of a commitment in this country that we should have a minimum floor of justice and decency in how we treat each other. That's what I'm deeply worried about. That's the context in which we operate. And if all we do is celebrate entrepreneurs and don't think about that context, we're not going to be truly relevant for the times we live in. And so at the Nonprofit Finance Fund, we don't think about impact investing or social entrepreneurship as something that can occur outside that context. We think about it as a central part of the answer to the most profound question we are all called to answer. And that is, if this old model is breaking down, and it's not just because of inequality, it's also because of just basic structural demographics and finance. The business people, the finance people call it structural deleveraging. The policy wonks call it fiscal consolidation. The people I work with, they call it a budget crisis. And they feel it every day in the number of people that have to turn away from the services they deliver. If we don't have something to say about what's the new model we're going to build after that old model is falling down, because it's not coming back. Government is not going to have more money in the future. That's where I think impact investing needs to go. And rather than ending on a downer and saying, well, I'm worried it's not happening, I am deeply excited about what is going to happen when the social entrepreneurship and the impact investing spirit accepts the context in which it operates. And very briefly, I'm getting a signal to wrap up. At the Nonprofit Finance Fund, we really think of two incredibly exciting ways that business as unusual is going to replace business as usual, because business as usual for our clients is dying. The Great Society, it's on life support and it's not coming back. Two things we're doing to work with some very exciting partners. One is something that we call total capital. If you can come up with a better name, I'll buy you a beer later. But total capital is the idea that in many cases, the most interesting things we're going to do in the next decade are going to be exactly where we apply social entrepreneurship and impact investing deeply connected to government and philanthropy. So instead of creating a spur outside and say where markets have failed and where governments failed, let us as social entrepreneurs succeed. We actually think the most exciting work we're seeing is when we start from a social problem, take the fact that poor communities don't have access to fresh food in California, and organize a system around that. And that system is going to include impact investors. It's going to include social entrepreneurs. It's also going to include governments. And in many cases, the most exciting work we can do is exactly the work in which no one part alone can succeed. And I'm happy to get into some specific examples of work we're doing in New York City and elsewhere to put total capital to work where we believe we can actually structurally change the ability of our organizations to offer the basic just and decent society that we need. The total capital is one area. I think another really interesting area that's promoted by the work of social entrepreneurship and impact investing, and Kathy mentioned the whole work around social impact bonds. I think there's a broader story there. It's the idea that part of the answer to the question, what's the new model that's going to replace the old one that's dying, is a system in which we put more of our assets to work into those solutions that can really prove that they deliver the outcomes that can make a difference, as opposed to our current system, which largely funds organizations that deliver outputs. Might sound a little wonky, but it's deeply disruptive and incredibly profound. I'll end by saying that both total capital and an outputs-based world is a world in which you cannot operate alone. I think this is the main theme I wanted to tie together, and that is entrepreneurs are great, and you need people like Willie Foote and Bob Patillo and Tina Castro in California to break and do what they've done against a set of systems that don't work. But the most exciting work, I believe, is going to be done in the next decade by people who understand how to put total capital to work, who understand the systems required to build an outcomes-based way to create a decent and just society. And the skills those people are going to need are not going to be exactly the same as the skills that were needed when we were trying to build this space. It's going to be a deep capacity to think about systems and not just about institutions, and an incredible ability to put different coalitions together. So when I think about total capital, it's financial capital, it's intellectual capital, you're going to need ideas, it's human capital, you're going to know how to have to get things done, and it's social capital, the ability to really organize complex organizations, because the whole premise of this new world we're building is that no one piece alone is going to be successful. That's what I think we're called to do. I really believe the context in which we're having this conversation is a context in which a fundamental system that has worked for most people for 40 years is failing. And while institutions and individuals touch different parts of the beast, it's the people who can understand this meta-narrative and understand exactly what's happening who will have the vision to see that we have to build a new system and have the capabilities to organize the various kinds of people into those systems. Those are the people who 20 years from now, when we build our Impact Investing Museum, are going to be counted as the ones who stood up to the moment, because they didn't just think about being an entrepreneur, they didn't just think about building systems, but they understood the context we're in, and that's what we're being called to do. And so I'll end it there, just to say that it's incredibly exciting to be here. You guys are already on the first step, because you're already out ahead of the systems. Systems are lagging indicators of your aspirations and ambitions, and so you haven't chosen an easy road. It'd be a lot easier for you to be going to your McKinsey and your banker interviews right now than being here, but it's, I would say ultimately it's going to be far more fulfilling, and when we do look back and say, did we stand up when we were counted, we'll be able to say we did, and I think that's it's an incredibly exciting community to be a part of. Thank you.
So we have a little bit of time for Q&A. And Antony asked me to help him do this. I'm not sure why, but here we are. So some questions? Yes.
Oh, that worked out well.
Your mic.
There you go.
Do anything different. My name's Jeff Ward. I teach at the law school, actually. And I was curious to know if you had one piece of advice you would give to young attorneys just entering the profession, because they make similar choices to students at the business school about what path they're going to take. What would your advice be?
I don't know if I have advice for attorneys. One thing I've learned by working on impact investing is, maybe I was naive. I used to think that the law existed to tell you what to do. Having worked in a new system where we're trying to make, I hate to say this, I might be threatening some people's careers, but we're trying to force fit a legal system into a new set of aspirations. Now, that's the exciting thing about impact investing. I think it's happened in other areas as well. So I used to think the law told us what to do. I've now learned that the law really exists to give lawyers ways to have fun structuring things. The day that I made a for-profit investment with foundation money that was qualified as charitable into a Mauritius vehicle wholly owned by a US 501c3, that's when I really realized that. True story. So, I don't have any sort of specific advice. I think the advice I'd have generally is a lot of what I say to people is similar to what you hear from your career counselors. All I would say is you have to think even more so. So when your career counselors say, go out and network like mad, well, that's true anyway. You want to work in impact investing, doubly true. Because the established career paths, those systems don't exist in our world, and the talent markets don't clear as well. The other thing I'd say, and increasingly, it's not just where you find work, but it's the spirit you bring to your work. A lot of this is simply about not accepting that what people tell you the way the world should be is right. So if you're at a law firm and someone says, well, you can't possibly advise your investment client to put an investment into a Ugandan-based private equity fund focused on investing in farmers, you can. I think a big part of it is just don't let anyone tell you no. And I think that's a spirit that I hope you all bring to your classes. Because a lot of the assumed truth out there is just wrong. And it's hard when you start to see the world in a new way not to get self-righteous and feel like you have this new truth. So I'd say, don't take anything for granted, but don't be self-righteous. And I'm happy to spend more time on that one as well.
Another question?
It's encouraging to. My name is Dave Nicola, first year. It's encouraging to hear you talk about systems change and systems thinking. And obviously, as you just mentioned, business school is many of the things we learn are fundamentally flawed. And that's one of the larger
They're with
missing.
you. See, they're with you.
Okay, I said it, yeah. I'm happy to say it again.
He went $100,000 into debt to learn things that are wrong. But.
We have to know what's wrong to be able to argue against it in the future. And obviously systems thinking is one of the things that's potentially missing. And in the realm of systems thinking, in terms of impact investing and social entrepreneurship, it seems like there's a bifurcated approach. So you need to work within the system in order to allocate more money towards impact investing and things that are socially responsible, environmentally responsible, as well as simultaneously change the system. So I'm curious your thoughts on that in terms of what's more important, what's easier, and what are, I guess, the initiatives of within the system acting.
Yeah. I don't know, I'm probably dating myself. Does anyone here know who David Brower was? He's sort of the godfather of the US environmental movement, who took over the Sierra Club and really built it into a major force. He lived well in his 80s, not his 90s, and I had an opportunity to meet him. And at the time, I was radical and 17 or something. And the big environmental debate was sort of, should you join, work within the system and try and get people elected and, get the carbon markets created, or should you go out and spike trees so that lumberjacks couldn't cut them down? And I think Earth First at the time was more radical, and they represented that radical side, and then there's sort of Greenpeace and others on less radical side. So anyway, I said to David Brower, I had a privilege to meet him. I said, what should I do? Should I go out and spike trees, or should I go out and work within the system? And he said something that really stuck with me, which is, that's the wrong question to ask. Because frankly, we need everyone doing everything. And this is exactly the point about what happens when we stop thinking about this as about entrepreneurship, and we start thinking about this as systems change. When you're changing systems and you're building new mindsets, that becomes a much more expansive, that becomes a social movement. And there's a role for everyone to play. And so the point is not to say, what's the best thing I can do for the movement, but rather, what's the right thing for me? And the answer to that question is going to be about you understanding your personality, you understanding your personal family situation. You need a stable job with the 401k, and therefore, can you find work in a corporation that's more appropriate? The point that's exciting is once we start thinking about this as a social movement, there's a role for everyone. And it was more limited. When you had to be someone who could quit Harvard Business School after 2 weeks to be a part of this, that kept a lot of people out. So again, I think I don't say to people, go out and join an impact investing startup. Or I wouldn't similarly say to you, go and work in GE and try and shake them up from the inside. Find what works for you. Find what for a set of conditions that I can't solve for, but you can. And then do what's right for yourself. And throughout that journey, hold on to remembering why you do what you do. Because wherever you end up can really skew who you are. Hold on to a self-referential sense of what's valuable, and then you'll do something useful. What's not going to be useful is if you are someone who really needs to be in a stable job and you do a startup and you drive your family crazy. Or if you're someone who really belongs in a startup and you do a corporate job and you drive yourself crazy. So the key is just, look into yourself and say what you need to do, because there's a role for everyone.
Great. Scott?
Can you talk more about, Scott Kleinman, about first year, talk more about two transitions that it seems like you made. One is moving from the foundation philanthropy side to now being an implementer on the nonprofit side. And the other piece of going from working within an organization to now being the leader of an organization, and how you've sort of thought about those transitions and worked through them.
Yeah, I mean, so the short answer is I don't think enough. I'm not that intentional about my career, but it's funny when people say to me, it's almost sort of pitying, like you did this sacrificial thing, you left the hallowed halls of philanthropy to slum it down in the nonprofit. I just never thought of it that way. I've worked in for-profits that made money, McKinsey, lots of it. I worked in for-profits that didn't make money. I was a journalist for a struggling newspaper. I worked in nonprofits. I worked for national government. I worked for international government. And I've worked for foundation. And in all those jobs, I've found highly motivated, incredibly talented, principled people working incredibly hard to do great work. And I've found frustrated bureaucratic people. And I just think I don't see your tax status as a particularly useful analytical tool to understand who you are as an organization. So that's sort of my starting point. I've never thought about making the leap from one of those designations to another, because to me that's never been the salient way I've thought about my career. I do think there was a very conscious choice to decide to move from a foundation into an implementing role, partly because I think there's, we talk about this in our chapter on leadership. Leadership takes different forms in different phases, and there's been a moment in time over the last few years where we could really push this movement forward by doing some of the stuff Kathy described, by defining it, creating the rhetorical umbrella under which a lot of different people could huddle and organize. That's the work I did at Rockefeller. I really believe that over the next few years, this whole movement's going to be pushed forward by people actually getting deals done, and that the best insights are going to come from people who are coupling their intellectual capital deeply to the human capital of actually doing the work. That's not to say that I sort of would say, again, this is all contextual. There are times when it's going to be great to be at a think tank. There are going to be times when it's going to be great to just be an investment fund. What I found in the nonprofit finance fund is a magical blend of practical work and a mandate for our work to be more meaningful than just the work we do. So I have a charge from my board, and my staff feels deeply a mandate not only to do some deals and lend and work with great nonprofits, but also to amplify the impact by learning what we can from those experiences and using the kinds of microphones we get to tell the stories and to have the systems level view that many of the people we work with, the nonprofits, like the woman I mentioned who's running that homeless shelter, doesn't have the mandate or the space to do. So I think for me, it's about landing in a place where I could still have a mandate around intellectual and ideas and movements and systems, but to have it deeply grounded in the work itself. I think that's what the next phase is going to be pushed most forward for. But again, to your question, find what's right for you and do it. I think the other part of your question about transitioning to leadership, I mean, it's fantastic, but it's also incredibly exhausting. I go home at like 10 and sleep every night. It's not an unusual experience for people who make that transition into being a CEO. And I think a lot of that has to do with, again, we all lead in different ways. Even that's an arbitrary distinction, because when I was at Rockefeller, I had a team I was leading. When I was at TechnoServe, I led country programs, even though I wasn't the CEO. But I think the most exciting and powerful aspect of leadership, when it's sort of official and when you're the CEO, is that you don't just lead through what you do. It's not just the work you do, the investments you make, but you lead in every action you take because of the way in which you are modeling for the people around you the sort of manifestation of the culture you want to build. That's what's exhausting about it. It's the fact that it's not just getting the analysis right or standing up and being really effective in the presentation you give. That's something you're going to experience in lots of different places in an organization. But I think when you're the CEO, while you do that, people are also constantly watching and saying, well, how does this implicitly or explicitly signal a certain way that we're going to be doing business here? Again, I don't think that's just the CEO. I think we dismiss our importance in organizations when we assume that leadership only occurs in the people who are leaders on the org chart. The nice thing about systems thinking is what you recognize is that every one of us impacts the systems we are a part of. And one system you're all going to be a part of, hopefully, is a professional one. Whether you're the CEO or not, your actions on a daily basis are determining the kind of place in which you work. I just think that's amplified, and the responsibility is clearer when you're in a CEO role.
Sure. Justice on first year.
You're getting a mic.
Oh, okay. Yeah, project, but hi. Hi, Jessica Sani. I'm a first year. Thank you for being here. It's great to hear about systems and not just an asset class or metrics, which come up a lot. So my question is, in previous work I was doing before business school, we debated who is the best impact investor. So is it the philanthropist who they're concerned with social impact? Is it the VC community who cares about profits and can choose good businesses? Or is it a hybrid, or is the best impact investor an institution? Sort of who do you, I'm just curious on your opinion on who that is.
Yeah, so I think the best impact investors are going to be the people who organize around the social problems they seek to solve. And again, that might sound really simple, but if you organize your impact investments around the tool you hold, so I'm a venture capitalist, where can I find great deals? Or I'm a foundation, where can I make program-related investments? I think you're going to disqualify yourself from being in the running to be the best impact investor. The most exciting impact investing I'm seeing are the people who start from the question, what are the social issues I care about that need to be solved? And not just I care about, but some aspect of making good judgments about what the social issues are, but then understanding that the tools are what we mobilize around the problem. They're not what we mobilize around ourselves. So I think the great example, I've told Tina Castro from California Down that the California Fresh Work Fund is my current impact investing crush, because they absolutely did that. And there's going to be a case study coming out about this. They said the thing we care about is ending food deserts in California. Poor communities should have access to healthy, affordable food in reasonable travel distance. What they did then was organize impact investing alongside grant making, alongside the government, alongside other assets around that problem. I'm less interested in are you a venture capital, are you a debt provider, are you a boutique new fund, are you a large-scale institutional investor, than I am, are you participating in those kinds of systems built around solving social problems. For us at the Nonprofit Finance Fund, we're very excited in the city of New York, where the social service agencies, soup kitchens, homeless shelters, another organization like that, they're about to face another $112 million of budget cuts from the city next year. They are facing an increase in demand for their services. If you start from the question of how can we lend, you're actually not going to be able to lend to them. We've tried that. It turns out that things were bad about 2 years ago, so we thought we could provide them with working capital to help smooth things over. Now things are so bad, they can't even take on working capital because we can't underwrite the loans. So when you start not from the question of can I lend, but rather how do we ensure that our communities have a decent safety net for people who've fallen out, especially now, then what you end up doing is you bring in impact investors like us who have a certain loan cap balance sheet. We're going to be bringing in commercial banks who are willing to take a senior tranche in that. It's going to require the city to come in or someone working on it, provide a loan guarantee because you can't actually do these deals at market rate. And importantly, it's going to require philanthropists to come in and recapitalize some of these organizations with grant money. Because we started with the problem, what we're going to end up with is a very complicated system that's going to involve lots of different people. That, to me, is where the best impact investing is going to happen in the future. And one thing I should say about the 3 examples I chose of my good news, they are all examples of that. Even though we talk about them as impact investing, in the case of the New School Finance Company, they're putting investments alongside grants, and the grants are helping to fund research to just make sure those schools really are delivering a great education. So they're sort of working that system together. That's total capital. I've already mentioned in California, and with Root Capital, they also blend financial capital in the form of loans. They bring in grant money, which still sustains their operations. They have a lot of intellectual capital. They've developed a new way to do this kind of supply chain finance. And they put huge amounts of human capital into this cauldron by working with the pharma cooperatives in Rwanda and Uganda and elsewhere to help them get to the point when they're ready to absorb impact investing money. That's the most exciting work I'm seeing, is when total capital is brought around organizing around the social problem and not putting a fetish around the tool. We couldn't do that 5 years ago because 5 years ago we still hadn't established enough space in which people recognized that an investment was a morally legitimate and economically effective way to solve a social problem. Now that we've pushed that space out, in the arena we've created, I think some of the most interesting work is going to be this total capital approach.
So I love the fact that we invited you here to talk about your book, and you're promoting completely new ideas that aren't in the book. So 2 months later, we got new things.
Just still buy the book.
Yeah, no, the book is.
And for everyone you know, for
great.
Christmas
Right,
or
exactly.
whatever you celebrate, we can get you a good
It raised a
group
question
discount.
for me, though, in your explanation, which I think is really interesting, which is, what expertise does it take to blend these different kinds of capital, because you can say, well, maybe the venture capitalist or the PRI maker won't be the most effective impact investor, but that's how the money is organized. So it seems like you have two choices. You either have intermediaries that become very good at layering and blending and creating total capital structures, or you have institutions like Root Capital, which build that expertise from inside. What do you see between those two models kind of trend-wise, and what would you like to see more of? And what does it mean for talent?
Sure. I mean, both. So again, I'm not going to give you easy answers because we need all of it. This isn't just about building discrete deals. This is about building a movement and changing how we solve problems. So we definitely need all of it. I think in terms of talent, I was talking to Beth before about this. The talent markets don't clear, and I did this once. I won't do it again. I had a bunch of students from another business school visit me at Rockefeller to talk about impact investing. There are 20 of them, and I said, how many of you want to be an impact investor after you graduate in May? And 18 hands went up. I said, how many of you think you will have a job in impact investing after you graduate in May? And 16 hand went down. Someone else pointed out that maybe of those 16, most didn't think they'd have a job at all. But that was last year. I'm sure you guys are fine. So I think there's a huge, again, this is nothing new. Don't feel special. Anytime a new set of aspirations have moved through a society, they're going to move through younger people first. And the systems and the talent markets and the other systems are going to take time to catch up. That's what we're living through. And frankly, if you don't like that, then there's lots of existing ways to go on either side of the bifurcated world. I think that's going to be, it's going to shrink over time. But right now, impact investing and social enterprise are a rapidly growing talent market from a tiny base. So almost every impact investing fund I know, and the firms are hiring. They're hiring like employee 5, while UBS is firing employee 10,000. I mean, that's sort of, it's a shrinking, it's a rapidly, tiny and rapidly growing part of a shrinking industry. It's a fascinating place to be. When it comes to talent, I think a few years ago I would have said to people, jump onto one side of the bifurcated world, go to Goldman, go to McKinsey, learn some things for a few years, and then 4 years from now you're going to be able to jump the other way. I think in your work you've probably seen this. There has been a one-way door opening in the last 10, 15 years for people to go from the for-profit world into the nonprofit world, if we want to organize things that way. And that one-way door is something I would have encouraged people 5, 10 years ago. I would say, look, if you want your option value in 5 years to be maximized, go do the mainstream thing, get the skills, because frankly, the McKinseys and the Goldman have the capital to train you in a way that a lot of these startup firms don't. I don't say that with such conviction anymore, because when I hire at Nonprofit Finance Fund, when I hired someone for the PRI program at Rockefeller, I actually have the luxury that I don't have to hire people from one side of the bifurcated world to bring them into the middle. I'm able to hire people now who've been in both worlds. And so I'm not as, and I teach at Columbia Business School, and I say the same to my students, I'm not as convinced as I was before that if the thing you want to do is have the most option value to be in this space 5 years from now, you are best off going into the mainstream world. I would have said that with much more confidence a few years ago. If you can find the right job in this world and get 5 years of experience behind you, you're going to be in a great position. I think the challenge is that most of the jobs in this space are in small organizations that don't have the capacity to train. I'm not going to train you in underwriting to come work in my 70-person nonprofit if I can outsource that cost to Goldman Sachs and have you trained there. So when it comes to hiring, I'm not necessarily going to be looking to hire someone who, if I've got lots of applicants who have already had that training elsewhere. And so I think that's the reality that on one hand, but at the same time, I'm not going to hire you if you just come from one of those experiences, because increasingly I'm going to have options with people who have done both. So in terms of how do you get that experience, again, there's no substitute for hustle. Everyone I know with a great job in impact investing either founded something, which is not a path I'd encourage most of you to go down. I hope you took that message. We need people to build careers, not new organizations. There's 1.5 million nonprofits in America.
Excuse me.
I don't think in the new world that we're going to build, there's going to necessarily be that many if we're really serious about solving problems in an efficient way. So I wouldn't say start something new. I think at the same time, most people I know in great impact investing jobs got there through networking, volunteer while you're at school, call people up. One thing about impact investing in social enterprise is because we are operating in a new world and a lot of the systems that we operate in don't support us, we tend to be seeking camaraderie. A lot of people say to me, I wish I had the support group. The Global Impact Investing Network on some levels, the Investor Council is a support group, because what unites all of us is that two things. None of us can explain to our families what we do when we sit down for Thanksgiving, which is kind of stressful, and it's nice to find other people with that same problem. And not all, but most of the people who do impact investing do it in institutions who think they're nuts. So when I was at Rockefeller, most people there said, I came here to end poverty. Why you hang out with billionaires? My friend at JP Morgan, who created the social finance unit, most of her colleagues said, why are you here doing this? JP Morgan's a great way to make lots and lots of money. We get together and we can really bond. And so I think because we tend to be a group that is still seeing itself as iconoclastic, and we tend to be a group that sees a lot of the world as not understanding what we do, I think it's true to say that we're more community oriented when it comes to if someone cold calls us, we're probably more likely than most to take that phone call. We're more likely to meet with you than might otherwise be the case, because there is a real spirit that pervades a lot of this work that is about sort of movement building and trying to sort of create camaraderie. And so that'll change over time. This will become boring. And once the systems get built and all of us stop complaining about how hard it is to deal with regulations that don't understand this and how hard it is to measure impact, it'll be easier to do the work. But my hypothesis is a lot of the pioneers will get bored and leave. Because even though we complain about this all the time, we complain about operating without systems that support us, it's obviously what gets us out of bed in the morning. And I think that spirit is something you can tap into. But there's no easy answers on how to forge a career in this space.
Let's do one last question from the audience. Yes.
Hi, I'm Lindsay Michaelides, and I'm a second-year student. Before business school, I worked as a development director for an organization that served the homeless, and I definitely experienced kind of the shift in the philanthropy space of moving towards more outcome-driven approach, which I fully support, and support the consolidation in the nonprofit sector that will inevitably result from this market-driven approach. However, I'm curious how you manage this transition when some of the basic needs services like homeless shelters and food kitchens are inherently output-based versus outcome-based, and if you think the total capital approach is the way to manage that transition, or if you see it more as a long-term solution to the problem.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I just want to be really clear. When we say outcomes-based financing is one answer to the question, how are we going to rebuild a decent society? I don't equate that with funders telling nonprofits exactly what to do and giving them really restricted project grants. That's something that we at the Nonprofit Finance Fund have rallied against very powerfully over the last decade and more. There's a real need to be smart about how we put money to work in nonprofits. At the same time, we've got to figure out how to get more money into the hands of those organizations that can deliver the social outcomes we care about. Right now, we've set up a set of systems that have organized and steered lots of very hardworking, very smart, well-meaning people who run nonprofits to respond to a set of incentives that are around outputs. And where we believe is there's huge potential in reorganizing those incentives so that nonprofit leaders, for instance, in the case of homelessness, are not incented to put as many people into beds per day, per year as they can and get paid for that, but instead are actually incented to get people into homes. Right now, if you're outputs driven, it's I get paid per bed and I get some sort of margin on the beds that people I put into beds. In the outcomes-based world, you would actually be paid for getting those people completely out of homelessness. There's two things about that. One is, in most cases, you're not going to be able to do that as an individual institution. It's going to immediately force you to think in a more systemic way. But the other really important point is, this won't be successful if we leave behind those organizations who do great work but simply aren't able to make the bridge into proving how great their work is in this new system. So when I say outcomes-based, it's not let's suddenly turn all the money away from people who deliver outcomes into those who can prove outputs. It's building the systems that can allow us to make sure that's a healthy transition, because that transition could be very unhealthy. So there's a lot of people saying we need to make this transition happen. Well, sure, but if it happens badly, then what's going to end up happening is we're going to, remember this, I don't care about outcomes for outcome's sake or that kind of financing. The problem we're trying to solve is how do we take our resources, which will be smaller over time than the need, and put them to work most effectively. If that's our organizing question and outcomes-based financing is a tool, then it doesn't become a sort of fetish we organize around. Instead, we say, how can we use that tool most effectively? Just really specifically, in the case of homelessness, the woman, the CEO I was with in Boston last week, she basically reoriented their entire operation away from making sure that anyone who needs a bed has a bed at night when it's cold to ending homelessness. Ending homelessness is an outcome. When she did that, she actually, it led her to say, well, I can't end homelessness by just going out and raising a little bit more money each year and putting into the current system that I run, because there's too many homeless people. But by having that reorientation around outcomes, she actually completely reoriented her business, and she looked and said, It turns out when she did the analysis that 80% of the beds were being occupied by 20% of the people, just because of how many people were there every day of the year versus most people who sort of rotate to for a few days. And when her challenge became the outcome of end homelessness, then the way she oriented her work was no longer, how do I make sure I put more beds and more buildings with beds for the people who come in? It was, how do I target those 20% and really figure out how to get them into supportive housing? It did two things. It reoriented her vision. It forced her into a systems change. And the reason we know her and the work we're doing with her is actually she's now merging or contemplating a merger with another major homeless services provider in the community. Again, I don't sort of treat mergers as an end in themselves. It was a result of her saying, if my goal is the outcome of ending homelessness, I have to be able to operate at a systems-wide level, which means I can't do it by just simply building my enterprise. I think that's a great example of why an outcomes-based approach is linked to a systems-based approach. Total capital is then what you're going to need. It's the tool you're going to need to put in her hand as she thinks about this, because she's not going to get there with just a little bit of government money, just a little bit of philanthropy. She's going to have to figure out how to put lending and philanthropy and government money and human capital and social capital together to make that change happen.
Great. So I'm going to ask you the last question. Not too negative, I hope. But we just came out of a case advisory board meeting where we're talking about the field of impact investing and really how fragile it is at the moment, right? There's a lot of interest and hype, and we will wrap up in 2 minutes, I promise. There's a lot of interest and excitement, whether you call it hype or excitement, but the funds are very small, and the amount of money under management is small. If you enlarge the field, as you've been talking about, right, it's actually a quite larger set of players. But what could go wrong? What could burst this kind of newfound excitement, and is anyone worrying about that?
Well, I am. And in a way, I wrote a book about it. I mean, I think our book about the system, if the system change doesn't happen, then there's 20 paths up the mountain of despair. I don't have time to get into them. If we don't change our legal systems, and we think we can just force fit our aspirations around the law as it exists, someone's going to go to jail. And if we don't change mindsets, and we think, well, we can prove that we're doing good, there's going to be huge backlash. And in India, those of you from India know that last October, there was a backlash around a combination of a public outcry and a political demagoguery, as well as some genuine political concern around the microfinance industry's impact on poor people. I see that as a failure. Some of those people, the early microfinance people in India, were impact investors. Mohammed Yunus took this prize a few years ago. I don't know if he would call himself this now, but he was one of the first impact investors in the modern era. They had done some great work in Bangladesh, where he pioneered it along with Faisal Abid from BRAC and others. That idea had gone to India. It was very powerfully located in one province, specifically in India. They thought they could just do deals, and they were sort of convinced enough in the righteousness of what they were doing that they felt as long as we're helping poor people by giving them loans, and they can use the loans to improve the outlook for their families, then we're okay. Well, it turns out they didn't address the mindset. And the mindset of most people is, anyone who lends to a poor person is a loan shark. And on some level, from immoral and evil to other things you can call them, because they didn't think about the political system that needed to change and the mindsets that needed to change, a fire was lit. And the microfinance industry, for most intents and purposes, is over in India for the next who knows how many years. People are going to die because of that. Poor people are not going to have food. Their kids are not going to go to school because of the failure of the collective impact investing industry in India to be proactive about the system change that need to occur. The same thing could happen here. It could happen anywhere. So I think the biggest fear I have is that if we simply push on with getting our own institutions grown or getting our deals done, and we don't think about the systems work, we really run the risks of any one of these systems failures could really, the educational system not supporting what we do. The last thing I'll say is whose responsibility is that work? Because most of the impact investors I know are killing themselves just to make this month's payroll, just to get this incredibly complicated idea out. I mean, Sarah, who's running IRIS, try creating a standard for measuring the social value of investments. I mean, this is stuff that took hundreds of years and billions of dollars. We're trying to do with shoestring budgets. I saw Bart Houlihan was here from B Corp. Gears is trying to build an entire rating system. These are not people who are lazy, and they don't lack vision. But in most cases, on a day-to-day basis, they don't have time to think about the broader systems in which they operate. They're just struggling to get their little thing done. That's a prisoner's dilemma. I mean, those of you who study economics know exactly what that means. Everyone optimizing for their own short-term needs, and I'm not saying in a short-sighted or in a selfish way, but just in a realistic way. Everyone optimizing for the little institutions in which they're working is going to result in a failure to build the systems we need. And that's my biggest worry. And I think those of us who have the ability to step back and understand the way the systems are formed have a real obligation to participate in that broader story.
Fantastic. Join me in thanking Antony for being here.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.